Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. I don't know if anybody is there yet, but we are here, Christy and I, Brown Girls Booking. We're here speaking with Crystal Wilkinson about her new book, Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost. So thanks for coming. Crystal, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Crystal Wilkinson. This is my fifth book. All of my other books have been fiction, um, or the first three were fiction, and then a book of poetry, and then we went straight to the nonfiction. I'm a professor and teach at the University of Kentucky, teach creative writing, and that's just a little bit.
Okay, great. All right, we're going to start asking Crystal a few questions of the book. We will be alternating questions. Oh, I have a few people in. Amalola and Morgan, welcome. Thanks for coming
Hi.
to
Hello.
watch this interview. All right, so my first question: what are kitchen ghosts, and how
Mm.
did you come up with this terminology?
Yeah, I think I had been often I think of my work as like a relay race, and then you hand the baton off to the next work. And so I think I've been like working my way up to writing this book for a really long time. But the idea of the kitchen ghost came when my grandmother died, and I was making my first holiday meal for my immediate family, for my children and my mother. And it just felt daunting, like without my grandmother. She
Mhm.
had passed, and I was just not thinking that I could do it. And I remembered that I had her dress, one of her dresses, in my closet, and I went back and got the dress out of the closet and brought it into the kitchen and hung it up. And just having her dress there, sort of in her place, sort of brought her into the kitchen with me in some ways. And that was the motivation that I needed. I felt her saying, come on, girl, get it together. You can do this.
Mhm.
You watched me do this. You helped me do this. Let's go. And yeah, that's the dress. And I still have it. And so that was the start of it. But I never wrote about it really um, face on. Um, I just would sort of slip it in, like it slipped into my novel, The Birds of Opulence. There's a mention of the kitchen ghost. It slipped
Mhm.
into my collection of poetry. There's a mention of it there. Until I was ready, I guess, to write about it sort of head on. So, I think it extends from that moment, but I think that we all have kitchen ghosts. We all have people, ancestors standing around us, motivating us, saying, "Come on, you can do this,
Yeah.
whatever it is." But it seems to be present for me most when I'm in the kitchen.
Mhm. Very nice.
Thank you for that. I think that's so
Yes.
true across
Mm.
so many different spaces for us all in terms of just the familial support of those there and not there.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
my question is going to be seated in craft, and typically they are. In your introduction, which I really enjoyed, you mentioned using the lyric essay as a vehicle to communicate this narrative. So, just for the viewers out there who aren't embedded in the craft, can you explain what the lyric essay is for your viewers and why that was a form that you gravitated toward in terms of a framework for the writing?
Mm-hmm. I think the lyric, the lyric essay, which I often think of as also the braided essay, is sort of
Mm.
innovative form in which you can do a lot of things, and it sort of speaks to there's a conversation between the lyric essay and the poem. And I think
Mhm.
that poetry um, has the ability to directly interface with memory in a particular way. And I think the hybridity of the lyric essay, or its ability to jump around in time, if you use it in that way, can also mimic time and time shifts, and the way that the ways that you stand in the kitchen, and suddenly the way the sunlight comes in the window transports you to a time in your childhood when you saw the light come in that particular way, or you felt the warmth of the sun in the window in that particular way, or the steam from the pot in that particular way. So I wanted the narrative to be able to travel from the past to the present, to the future even. And I thought the lyric essay was the perfect vehicle for that. And I've always written hybrid in a hybrid way,
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, my next question. Tell us about the importance and recognition of Black Appalachians.
Hmm. Um, yeah, people still ask me when I'm traveling around the country. People often say, oh, are there? Well, first of all, are there Black people in Kentucky? Or like, oh, there are Black
Mhm.
people in Kentucky, and I'm like, yeah, Bill Hooks and Gail Jones among them, but yeah. And then by extension, we often don't think about we see books written about them, but we don't think about Black people in rural spaces as much as we used to, or we think that that is a something of the past. And so, when you break it all down to Blacks in Appalachia, even when you look at the word, like if you look at an old dictionary, it'll say under Appalachian, it'll say white people indigenous to the Appalachian region.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I I claim it because it's mine. Because some people say, "Well, why do you even identify as an Appalachian? That seems to be a white thing." And my family has lived in the region for more than 200 years, so
Mhm.
I say it's ours as much as it is anyone
Absolutely.
else's, if not more. Um, so one of the things that I think that this book does is it at least I didn't write it particularly for that, but I think it enters the chat, right? It enters the
Yeah.
conversation, and
Yeah.
it's in conversation with other historical records. It's in conversation with dispelling the myth of Appalachia period as it being all white and it being, just rednecks or whatever people think about Appalachia. So I think
Mhm.
it helps to be in conversation to dispel those myths about what Appalachia is and who lives in Appalachia and who
Absolutely.
lived in the past in Appalachia as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
So this is a good kind of jumping point into my question with regard to dispelling myths and who gets to own what and what historical and economical narratives are brought to the forefront. I really enjoyed the way that you touched on the food as a carrier for those in the future and those in the past, to highlight the positive and in some cases very painful or challenging things that happen among your family. But what I thought was really elegantly done was the way in which we got these historical and economic markers of what was going on in the region and then in the larger narrative in the country. And I wondered how much of that, in terms of scope, you had to wrestle with to say, oh, I'm not going to let this be the totalitarian of my narrative. I'm speaking about my kitchen ghosts, not
Hmm.
the history of American agriculture, but it's there and that message is very much delivered. So I wondered about how you manage that balance and that pacing.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it, and I keep doing this, but I saw it as a narrative that traveled, like not only through my own family, but traveled for all of us. That there was something to be said, larger outside of my family, about the region, about being Black in America, and what it means and what it meant. Um, and so it was important for me to do a lot of research, even though I don't consider myself a historian. I um, Some people have called me on certain things already about, like, well, your if your your fourth great grandmother was born in 1795, perhaps slavery should have been over during her lifetime. And would her mother call to her in an African language? And I said, well, how do you know that she wouldn't? Like, how do
Mhm.
you know that that wouldn't have been still something that they preserved and carried through? Um, so I think a lot of this I consider to be, um well, let me put it this way. I thought it was important to have the facts. So there are facts there that I drop in about the sugar plantation industry, or
Mhm.
about slavery, both in the United States as a whole, and specific things that happen in slavery in Kentucky. I think there are not enough narratives about that. But
Mhm.
I also saw, like, my fourth great grandmother, Aggie, as a stand in for other unnamed Black women in this country. I think I'm fortunate to have found her and to even know that her name was Aggie in a lot of the historical records around my hometown and around Kentucky. Her daughter, Patsy Rife, who appears on the cover of the book, this is her
Yeah.
daughter, Patsy Rife. Um, there are historical records about her because she was sort of famous in the town as the only sort of colored Black businesswoman that was well known.
Mm.
But in those documentations, it'll say something like, it always says that her mother was a slave and her father was a white businessman. Sometimes it'll say her father was a wealthy white businessman. Um, And so it was daunting for me to find her, to find Aggie and say, oh, this is Patsy Rife's mother.
Mhm.
She was never named in those documents. And so one of the most emotional times writing it was when I found Aggie. And I felt as if I was able to, as an intellectual woman, as a professor, as a Black woman in America, we know what a horrible legacy slavery was. And we're still getting repercussions from that sort of that enslavement mentality that is marked in this country. But to actually put your finger on it, to see her go from being named Aggie of color to being Aggie Wilkinson,
Mhm.
that sort of personal touch, to be able to touch the ink, where in the court documents that were available to me, to look at from the 1800s, and to touch a document that has, you know, where my fourth great grandfather, who was white, deeded Aggie
Yeah.
some kitchen items.
Yeah.
And, I don't know how literate they were, so it wasn't their writing, but the court recorder had recorded that document, and I was able to touch the ink. And so for me, it just it washed over me in such a strong, visceral way that, I was crying. I had to go to my car and said, like, in the courthouse they have these big huge, I don't even know what they're called, like court record documents. They should be in a museum somewhere or something, because
Mhm.
they're from the 1800s, and they're still encased in velvet, and they're huge. Like, I had to stretch my arms out wide to even lift them up to look in them, and dust was flying up from them as I plopped it onto the table and turned to the portion of where they were. And the ink is barely, in some cases, still legible. But I felt like I was touching that time in a way that you can't just sort of intellectualize it when you're reading about the history. It was such a personal moment for me to be able to touch that, and it echoed. Right, how many tens of thousands of Aggies were there? Hundreds of thousands of Aggies in this country, and how many millions of people are descendants from those unnamed people. So that speaks to you, Christy, about the hybridity too, and the
Yeah.
craft and the form.
Mhm.
How could I not, when I had those tools as a fiction writer, uh, and also like the spirit and the ancestral intuition to allow her to speak for herself,
Right.
to give her a voice, and by giving her a voice, to give voice to all of those hundreds of thousands of other unnamed Black women who were enslaved. Like I just had to do that.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's awesome. Thank you.
My next question is: Praise Song for the Kitchen is an unforgettable sensory experience. Were you aware of how your writing contributed to this experience? Because for me, I got the smells, I got the warmth, and I got the sound. There
Hmm.
were moments where, when you were describing the cooking, I could hear like bubbling and, clicking of knives cutting. And yeah, I think I was just really, really into it, but I got all of those things.
Yeah, I don't think I was. Uh, the one thing that I was aware of is how we relive memory through the senses, or how I do, and so I wanted to try to convey that. How when the steam touches your face, or you smell a certain spice,
Yeah.
and automatically, like my one of my best friends is Shauna Morgan, and she's from Jamaica, and we sort of exchanged kitchen ghosts, and we talked about our ancestors. And I said, for me, one of them is, the jam cake, and it's the cinnamon and the cloves. And so she said for her it was those the hibiscus leaves, as soon as they like hit the water to make sorrel, that she can immediately, that she's right there with her grandmother. She's a wee person, right, little girl, right beside her grandmother. So I wanted to try my best to get as close as I could to recreating some of those experiences through the senses. And so I did spend a lot of time closing my eyes and try to recreate those moments through seeing, and sort of walk through the sensory details. I had to pare them back a little bit, because I some of those were really long of me thinking about it, and then I had to sort of pare them back and put them back in.
I really like them. I think this is the jam cake.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So you
And,
know
it's
what I was
delicious.
Sean
It's
and I
also
did
one of the
a cultural exchange during the holidays. So she fixed sorrel, Jamaican style,
I love sorrel.
for me,
nice.
and I gave her some slices of jam cake, and so we had this. We felt like we were trading kitchen ghosts.
Exchanging, yeah.
Yeah.
So in Jamaica
Wow.
they have a food that like when I read about it, because in the Bahamas we do fruit cake, but
Uh
our
huh.
fruit
Mm.
cake is more on the clove side. But even
Mm-hmm.
in Jamaica they have something called spice bun that's dense, and like when I read the ingredients I was like, oh, I wonder if there's some kind of like branching given like when people came over through the transatlantic slave trade, where this is what this ended up looking like in this country, versus just because the ingredients are so similar and
Mm-hmm.
just that the end product is different. So that's like really interesting that you and your friend did that exchange, because like
Yeah.
sorrel is something that you eat with like spice bun or like a fruit cake.
Yeah.
And so that's like a really like nice little like blip of
Yeah.
happenstance there. I really love to hear
Mm.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought the same thing when she told me about like black cake and how it's prepared, and
Yes,
and
so,
yeah, yeah,
so yes, very much so. Actually,
yeah.
even more so. So I
Yeah.
finished university in Jamaica, so I spent like 2 or 3 years there, and their food, especially their drinks, just so good. I think it's something
Mm-hmm.
about the soil there that's so much
Mm.
more um, rich than it is in the Bahamas. And the Bahamas are
Mm-hmm.
very like citrus fruit, limestoney. So nothing really grows there except like pineapple, grapefruit, oranges. And so to go to Jamaica and literally be able to be like, I'm just gonna pick this fruit right here
Uh-huh.
and eat it, or like I'm gonna have this juice where I like legit taste this fruit that I've only just tasted in my life for the first time. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm going to pivot a little with my question again, and still in kind of keeping with the craft. So in your memoir, you mentioned bell hooks
Mm-hmm.
and bell hooks writing several times, and of course, I'm always interested in who was inspired by what when they were writing, and then also what they're reading now. So my question is like a very readerly and writerly question, which is, what were you inspired by outside of those books that you referenced in terms of when you were thinking about putting together this book, or even things that you were just like, I know this isn't what I would want to do, so like not this type of book when you were writing, and then what in general is interesting to you in terms of like form and narrative when you're just reading for pleasure?
Mm.
What types of books?
So for the latter, one of my favorite genres is the short story cycle, and somewhat for the same reasons. Like,
Perfect. That's
you
Christy's
too,
favorite
Christy.
part.
I
She
I
loves it,
see
Christy.
it.
That's
Yes.
what I get for life.
Yeah, that's my favorite. That's my favorite lane. If I could write a cycle over and over again, which I sort of have. Water Street and Birds of Opulence is also a cycle of sorts, or could be thought of that way. That's my favorite. As
Mm.
far as what I was reading, like I looked at like Miss Edna Lewis. Um, Country Cooking was a big influence. I was looking at women's memoirs, so I was looking at uh, and some of them weren't even memoirs, but I looked at poetic writing like Maud Martha. Um,
Oh, yes.
yeah, I looked at
Yeah.
Maud Martha. I looked at Miss Edna Lewis's cookbooks and her upbringing in. I think she was brought up in Virginia, and her life as a rural person thinking about cooking. Um, I looked at Miss Clifton's what is the name of that book? Her memoir. What is the name of her memoir?
You're talking about
Uh
Lucille Clifton.
huh.
I know what you mean,
Mhm.
and I just like
My it just jumped out of my head, but I looked at I reread that, and I can't remember what else. I'm always like prescribing a book for myself to look.
generations.
Generations, yes, thank you. Yeah. So I reread both of those while I was writing. Um I think Gail Jones is always an influence, even though the book is about something else, and it's about a much more um, focused on a much more harsh topic. I did go back and look at Corregidora again, just
Yeah.
because of the matriarchal lineage, and
Hmm.
there's even an epigraph at the beginning about what Gail Jones has said, and so those were just some of the books that I sort of reread while I was writing or before I started writing.
That's awesome. I have some rereads now. I'm gonna reread Martha like immediately.
Yeah, because it's been a while since I read that one.
Yeah. And Jamaica Kincaid too. Jamaica Kincaid. I've always loved the fact I've always been interested in how she writes about home
Yeah.
and how she writes
Hmm.
about her people.
Hmm.
Um, and how she layers fiction on or takes fiction off.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's especially interesting to me. Dee Dee and I were having this conversation earlier in relation to your book about the way in which you are very clear with the reader, at least in my opinion, about when
Yeah.
I'm seated in this is generational data and information. This is a historical marker in which I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know the individuals, and therefore I'm extrapolating in this fictional way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then here are these tactile end products that may have started here or that I may not have had the written information from. I'm thinking specifically now about the I think it's the biscuits, but like here's what this iteration
Yeah.
of my memory and this end product looks like for me. And I just always felt like, even though it was kind of like if I was on a machine, like an elliptical movement, but at every point I knew where and when I was and what I was dealing with, like whether I was in the
Mm-hmm.
realm of like this form of historical fact or this form of extrapolation or this
Mm-hmm.
form of like echo from like an original product to create a new product. And I found that deeply enjoyable. And you're right, Kincaid does that, and she does that a lot in fiction,
Yes.
or
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
where like I'm just like, oh no, but this is like a legit real like thing from the Caribbean. Like, but like how she embeds it in the fictionality of it, it's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
you did it like in an inverted way, but I found it very, very pleasurable as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Jamaica Kincaid even uses some of the same names. Like she uses some of the real names of of her family, and I just love
Mm-hmm.
how she does that. Yeah, I mean, I think it also like format content, like because that's sort of one of the reasons. One of the things that came to me is like when I was doing the cooking, it's like how we can never replicate the food of our mothers. Like my grandmother could not replicate the food of her own mother, and she talked about that her entire life. And so I was thinking about that sort of innovation, and the fact that I was a vegetarian for 20 years, and um some of the things my grandmother did I didn't want to replicate. There were periods of time where I took pork completely off the table, or I took meat completely off the table, and so I saw the writing as the same way, as like, where how can I reach this, like this is like, how can I reach through the ages? How can I practice the concept of Sankofa? Like, how can I reach Aggie
Mm-hmm.
and therefore reach women of her time?
Yeah, yeah,
Fiction is the tool for that. Like that,
Yeah.
I say part fiction, part spirit, because I do believe that I was speaking with her at times, and depending on her guidance as an ancestor to tell me what to do next. In addition to like, for example, I tried to imagine what it would be like when I came across that document, the deed where he was, my fourth Charlton, fourth great grandfather, white man Charlton, was giving her, deeding her. Like, what makes a white man who owns everything go to the courthouse to
Yeah.
deed
I
a
like
woman
I like that imagining.
these items?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I imagine like he owned her children. I just imagine her saying, what's what's mine? What do I own?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if something happens to you, nothing will be mine. Like,
Yeah.
where's my agency? And him going and saying, okay, here's some here's some agency for you. You own these things legally.
It seemed very plausible to me because it seemed as though, I mean, not to gender things, but it seemed as though a question that somebody who is in a system that literally forces them to rely upon a peoples that are exploiting them would ask, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like internally or externally, depending on what the relationship is between
Mm-hmm.
them and the person who's in power. But it also, from another standpoint, seems like just that practical, like, oh, well, you inhabit this space already. So here
Yeah.
you go. Right. And like, I sat with that like very early on in the book for a while because I was just like, does this make me angry from his
Yeah,
perspective
exactly.
or not? Like, I really couldn't decide because like my initial, I think, instinct was anger. But then I thought to
Yeah.
myself, but is this a real recognition of where this person has found their identity and their autonomy? And then
Mm-hmm.
I was just like, or is it even an accident? Like maybe he didn't think about that much, but
Yeah.
like in being flippant, maybe or possibly flippant, what
Mm.
was bestowed, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it was already a right anyway, because that was the domain in which an individual like in that space would have inhabited. Like
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
we know that.
Yeah.
It was just like the kind of thing where it's just like actually don't feel angry because if this person didn't intend this, the power that was born out of this in terms of your book, right, where we
Mm.
have this product right here speaks volumes. And
Mm-hmm.
so the flippancy of or the possible flippancy isn't actually even the matter at hand. The matter at hand
Mhm.
is that what was given was something that was already well deserved and well earned, and this is how it it existed and has been gone on, and this is what's documented in the history,
Mm-hmm.
not this white man and merchant, but these are who now have a space in the written word, which is something that is going to live in perpetuity. Like I
Mm-hmm.
spent a lot of time just being like, and I was just like, girl, you ain't even in the book yet. What's happening? But
Well, and that was one of the things I try to do was have these things being held at the same time, for myself and for the reader and for women and for Black women, like to think about like, what does it mean to be feminist and carry your grandmother's traditions where you do all the cooking in the family?
Yeah.
right,
What does that mean for me? Like, what does that mean for my children? You know,
Mhm.
um, and what does it mean to be okay to let go of some of those things? And you know, where the kitchen is a place of toil, it's also a place of joy. Like, those are things that can be held at the same time. And I'm sure were held at the same time by our ancestors. Like I truly believe that um, while slavery was and is what it is and was, that our people, the women found ways to have joy and power and resilience in those roles that they were sort of forced into. And there was even a sort of power in being the one who cooked the meals too. Like, no matter what you're doing and what your power is over me, like whether or not these biscuits are burnt or whether I make them like okay or I give you my really really good biscuits today
Mhm.
is on me. And of course
Yeah.
there's like, the threat of like what would happen during slavery if they were burnt. But then there's
Mhm.
also like another area of there's another area, like, right? So I'm thinking about the space in between that's like, oh well, they're not really burnt, but I didn't give you my best, or I
Yeah.
didn't,
right,
or I only put so much lard in because I'm gonna take this lard back
Mhm.
to cook biscuits for my own family
yeah,
Yes.
with these other little things that I have amassed.
There's a bit of control to a certain extent.
Yes.
Just a bit of control.
Yeah.
So we have.
Yeah.
I was like Christy. I thought of it as a negative. It's like, oh, it's like getting the
Hmm.
iron for Christmas present. Today, but it's like, duh. We can't think of it as today. We have to think of it as we have to really, think think back of, so what was he really saying by this, by giving her these
Mm-hmm.
utensils? We can't just think of everything like we think of it today, which
Yeah.
is also a mistake that we often make as readers, is we have this 21st century gut reaction
Yeah.
before even thinking about what is really happening here. So I totally agree with you, Chrissy. I had the same. It's like, wait, what's going on here? What's happening?
Yeah, I had it too when I came across the information. Like, what does this mean? And
Yeah.
there's some other things that I didn't write about because I couldn't get any further past them. So like there are some records that were like torn out where he had a court case because he assaulted someone, and I thought, like, if he didn't marry a white woman and he was living with this woman as married during that time when it was illegal,
Mhm.
then if he chose not to marry a white woman at all, which all records indicate that, then his life probably wasn't easy. Like, he was left out of his father's will for a reason.
Yeah.
And there's several things like that I found. So
Okay.
there's some gray area,
Yeah.
maybe.
No, 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 there is. I'm so like, and that's why I sat with it, because I just was like, wait, don't be hasty, because these
Yeah.
things can mean more than they can, and a person can only function within the capacity of the bandwidth that they have. And what
Hmm.
we have in terms of capacity and bandwidth today is not nearly as narrow as what both, like when we're thinking about white people and black people, the
Yeah.
bandwidth was so much more narrow. So then I
Hmm.
think, like,
Yeah.
what would this translate to be? Like, what would this gesture look like today?
Hmm.
So, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
again, that those like pockets of autonomy that, like, whether intentional or unintentional, you're right. I'm cooking for your family, whether or not
Yeah.
you own me,
Yeah.
and a lot of power I have in my hands. I'm
Hmm.
Mhm.
midwifing your children into this world, like
Exactly.
power
Yeah.
in that. So I really kind of liked how you just like laid it out there, and then imagined how it might have been that, like, what do I own though, really, and then kind
Hmm.
of let the reader sit
Yeah.
with
Hmm.
what else that could mean, and what else that conversation did bear from that point of that
Hmm.
of that like deeding of stuff to
Yeah.
this end product of your book. I
Yeah.
like, you know,
I mean, I also think about her in terms of her daughter, right? Like, how do
Mhm.
you how do
Yeah.
you have a daughter who ends up being like the most famous black woman that
Yeah.
owned all these businesses and all the
Mhm.
stuff that came out? And yeah, she had her white father, but I believe that she got some of that resilience and tenacity and boldness from her mama too.
yeah,
So
Yeah.
that's how I like to think of Grandma Aggie as being, within the restraints of the situation that she was in, of having some agency.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay. My question: how did the COVID pandemic give thought to your family, food, tradition, and of course, to book? Praise song for the kitchen ghost.
Yeah, it turned everything upside down, right? I mean, I think that I wrote and worried and cooked and worried. A lot. I mean, so many of us cooked during the pandemic. Everybody went
Yeah.
through their banana bread phase and their we can't find flour phase, and
Yeah.
um so there was a lots of cooking going on, but there was also lots of thinking about traditions and how to carry them out. I write about it a lot in the book. My grandmother prepared, she got married when she was 14, prepared 60 years of meals and holiday celebrations by the time she passed away. Um,
That's crazy.
and I thought about that when I was sort of like in a tizzy. Like we have always carried these traditions on since she passed. Um, and my husband has a lung disease, so I was thinking, we cannot. My children run around too much, and I was like, we cannot.
Yeah.
Especially during the time when it was so deadly, I was like, we cannot
Yeah.
risk this.
And go out. Yeah.
So we did things on Zoom. We, so my children were, and they become characters, sort of
Mhm.
in the book when that's going on, because my son was like, "Oh hell no, this is not, this is not any kind of holiday. This is not working out." Even though he cooks, I taught him how to cook, and he is a single father, and he cooks for his family every day. But he was really upset about
Yeah.
misstepping of celebration. My daughters tried it, and we did it on Zoom, and it became hilarious. It was funny. It's
I like the way
really
you
funny.
described how when you said to your daughter, "Okay, take your butter now, butter the turkey," and the way you made it sound like she was just massaging this bird.
She was.
It was very like she was no longer the next meal. It was like a person. She was just
Yes,
massaging. And you're like, oh Jesus.
I was horrified. And then she put it on a really shallow, like she put it on a cookie tin, like a
Yeah.
big, yeah. I was like, oh my gosh,
Okay.
what has
What is
happened?
happening?
This sounds like I just want you to know I read that and I felt like so seriously for your daughters, just kind of like lack of conceptual like knowledge,
Hmm.
because I had those conversations with my mother where she was like, what's happening here? Like the words that I'm saying and the action that you're doing,
It's not the
where's the
same.
gap? Like, and it's not, it can't be on my end. And what were you doing when you were physically present with me in this kitchen with this
Yes.
food you
Yeah.
like to eat? Like, it was hilarious. And
Yeah. It's funny.
I just was like, okay, I'm just going to do this way. And she just was like, Lord.
What am I saying?
She's like, this child, like, I could like to the air, like, is this child educated? Like, and I was like,
That's exactly what I was doing. Like, oh my gosh, like
Right.
this
What is
daughter
it?
of mine, like what is going
Yeah.
on?
This turkey, what's going on with this turkey? 'Cause
Yeah, yeah.
it's getting a full on massage when it just needs some butter put on it.
Oh, they both of my girls, they um you know, though that holiday, that was interesting. But I will say that since then, that doesn't appear in the book, but like this past holiday, one of my daughters hosted, and I don't know, helicopter mommy, I guess. I made sort of part of a secret holiday meal here at home,
Mm,
just in
secret
case
holiday.
she didn't get it right.
yeah.
Yeah, way to
But
go.
she did a good job. She did a good job. So
Cool.
she sort of recovered, and then I thought I was home free. I was like, oh, okay, we got this. Like, is this how? And then she was like, no, 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 mommy, I can't. I wanted to see if I could do it. I did it. I will not be doing this every year.
Yes, I'm with her. You tell her that I know what it's like. She's in the rotation and she needs the
Mm.
several years until it is her turn again to build herself back up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
But she
you're
has the
giving
skill set, and that's the important thing because if she has the
Hmm.
skill set, she has the capacity to pass the skill set down.
Yes, she does.
Yeah.
you give the menu that your grandmother made. And this was wow, there's a lot of cooking
Yeah.
going on here.
Yeah.
There was the turkey, there were the green beans, there was the cornbread, there was the just so many dishes were all being made by one person. It's just
Hmm.
phenomenal. Phenomenal.
I love it.
Yeah. I
So
mean, I
of
still
course
find
it
it
always
daunting. I still do it.
yeah, see, but you see, I think it's always daunting and scary in the beginning when we've never done it before. Like you see the turkey and you're like, ah, what? And we haven't even done the rest. The turkey is always the thing that I think scares people the most. But I think when you do it once, it's sort of like your baptism into cooking the Thanksgiving or the Christmas dinner, and then
Yeah.
once you've done it, you can kind of like, okay, I've done it now, I can do it again. But if
Yeah.
you've never done it, it's always going to seem to be a daunting experience,
Yeah.
sadly.
And they
But it would be
reminded
great
me of
having somebody-
the pressure too, the pressure to,
Yeah.
um, in
Yeah,
addition to the skills of the cooking, the pressure that this is
yeah, it
the
is the only
holiday
thing
meal.
we have
So
to eat. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Totally get that one.
So this question is a little kind of like half formed, but I want to pull out this quote that Dee Dee reminded me of when I was talking to her about this question, where in the kind of like the middle of the book, page 95, uh, and in the middle of that page says 100 years ago, there were 1 million black farmers across this country owning upwards of 19 million acres. Now, most of it has been lost due to systemic discrimination, federal policies to aid independent farmers, such as the Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant College Act, were passed, both of 1862 were passed before emancipation. And this dovetails nicely with what might be for me, just because I love when I learn something new.
Hmm.
Educational purpose is my favorite chapter in this, which is the king of sorghum.
Hmm.
So, and for me, I adored this narrative. I loved learning about sorghum, what it was. But my question really is, you're like, you again, you have these moments where the food is almost its own act of resistance, right? Like starting from that conversation where I was like, hold on now, let me like really think about what putting these objects in the ownership of this individual resonated into. And then that like further, for me anyway, as a reader, kind of like extended itself in your grandfather, um, you know, basically saying, I'm doing this thing that may have been, again, for this simple reason, like, I am good at this. I want to keep a generational practice alive in terms of
Hmm.
making sorghum. This is a way for me to sustain my family and not have to engage in maybe the high prices of like sugar or sugar products. But really and truly, and you have another like really wonderful statement in there where you say this is an act of rebellion when you think about the fact that abolitionists really wanted to push sorghum as a product because the manufacturing of sugar was so heinous as a
Hmm.
product
Yeah.
of slavery. And like coming from the Caribbean and having sugar be like so supreme,
Hmm.
what our plantations look like, I think it really resonated with me. So my question kind of is, in terms of that focus, like what brought you there? I think it's something seated in the way in which Black farming was this thing that activated so much personal autonomy, right? Not just
Hmm.
for Black peoples, but for peoples in the Appalachian region. Um, like, what does that mean to you, and why is it important? You know, like in your cafe, you have the latte to promulgate that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that, a prime example of how that sort of agency and autonomy worked, like, even even you can't help but think about gender, but even without thinking about gender, my
Mhm.
grandmother and my grandfather had different lives. And
Right.
they had different lives because my grandmother was a domestic worker. And so she was in these white people's houses every day or several times a week, um, up close in a subservient role. My grandfather, however, was the keeper of his domain as a black farmer. That's all he did was his own land. So he was the king of his own land, and he attended his animals, and he milked his cows and took his product, to the end of the road so the creamery could pick it up. And he
Mm.
sold his cattle, and he attended his pigs, and he killed his pigs when he chose to kill his pigs. And he sold his corn and used his corn to feed his other animals. So you're right. So the agency of the black farmer, the freedom that the farmer had. Now, of course, there
Mm.
was toil, and particularly in Appalachia because of the rough terrain. But that sort of freedom, and you're talking about the sorghum. I didn't know a lot of that. Like, I knew that every year my grandfather made sorghum, and he made it with such pride. And doing that research and learning about the sorghum crop versus the sugar crop
I love that.
and what it meant, I started to think about, of course, that's why, one of the reasons why he had such pride in what he was doing.
Mm.
And, that also added to his agency to be his freedom, his agency to be a free man, a free black man in a white land.
Yeah.
Mm.
I just really love that. I love learning about it. I was just
Yeah.
like I literally thought to myself, I'm like, who do I know that is in agriculture in the Caribbean? Like, why aren't we into this? Is this a business? Like,
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
I really enjoyed it. I just love the idea of this family sustaining themselves and their daily living and their daily
Mm.
consumption being this radical act of like, you are not even a part of our consciousness
Hmm.
outside of when we decide that we need you to be.
Yeah.
I really like that.
Yeah. We're going to continue with the food. I have some food questions. Okay, so the
Okay.
food question is, can you tell us the difference between Black Appalachian food as opposed to Southern food?
Mm.
And then
That's
the
always a
second
good. Oh, go ahead.
question is just the idea of bread and cornbread, because that felt like to me the food thread, it's all about the cornbread. How are we doing the cornbread, y'all? That's what I need to know. Okay. Okay.
um, yeah, I mean, I think bread was important. Like, there was bread at every meal, and it was not, out of a bag that you bought
Yeah.
in the grocery. It was a homemade bread at every meal, and biscuits were for breakfast. Uh, some form of cornbread was for dinner and supper, lunch and dinner, and then the occasional loaf of bread, like you showed, and then the occasional, like on Sundays, instead of biscuits, there might be a yeast bread that might be that kind of bread, or it might be yeast rolls. Um, and if you've ever made bread, how much work that is. So I think that's another reason why the cornbread was sort of the primary. The variations of cornbread was part of the primary part of the meal. And what was your other question about food that you said
About the
before the
difference
bread?
between a Black Appalachian food as opposed
Oh,
to Southern food.
yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of overlap, but a lot of it, of the differences and the nuances, some of them are larger differences and some of them are smaller differences. It has to do with the terrain. Like in
Mm.
Appalachia, you cannot grow food in the summer. So
Okay.
so it's all about preservation. Like, when during this, I mean, in the winter, you cannot grow crops in the winter at all. So
Mhm.
it's about the preservation of those foods. Um, Drying apples so
Okay.
that you can have something sweet, either drying them or canning them, like,
Mhm.
constantly. canning blackberries so you can have the jam cake for the
Yeah.
holidays,
Yeah.
because otherwise you wouldn't have those. Uh, Preserving the meat. My grandfather would kill a hog, but in the South you might have a barbecue. Um, in Appalachia, you would have the preservation. Like you'd have the killing of the hog, you would have whatever you could do with the meat. So you're rendering the lard, you're
Yeah.
salting the pork to last all winter. So you have salt pork all winter.
Mhm.
You're curing the hams so that keeps. So in the winter, you can pull out the hams and cut that off and slice that off for
Mhm.
breakfast, or
Yeah.
have slice that off for dinner, or cook a whole one during the holiday so that you would have that meat. So that's the same with like why there was foraging too. It was all about that winter rough terrain in the winter. So by spring you were looking for not just something different than what you've had to eat all winter, but like for nutrition. Like you
Yeah.
start to go out into the woods when the things start to just begin to bud up, and you know which things to pick so that you can
Yeah.
have some rich nutrition, some vitamin C, some oxidants for antioxidants for your health, to get some spring tonic to get you
Yeah.
going. So those were some of the main things, was that sort of bent through tradition. One of the things that a big part of my job was to, like, when they would have potatoes in the summer, like we would have potatoes all summer after they came in, but then you had to take certain amount of potatoes, pounds and pounds of potatoes, and keep the dirt on them.
Oh
And
yeah.
some people would dig a hole to put the potatoes in, but we would put them in the attic. And so as a little
It's
girl,
hard.
since the attic was so small, that was one of my jobs, to go in and put the potatoes either on a sheets of newspaper or on pieces of tin, and not have them touch. And you keep the dirt on them so that they will preserve. Um, and so during my time, of course, we would go to the store and things like that when I grew up. But the generations before me, um, you didn't have that as much, or you couldn't get out. Even in my generation, we if it wasn't like, oh, here comes streets and roads to clean the roads if it snowed. You were in there. You were in there. You weren't getting out until
Yeah.
the thaw came. And so, about the end of February or 1st of March, those potatoes would start to shrivel up, but they weren't rotten. So you could still wash them
Yeah.
off, peel them, have fried potatoes or mashed potatoes or whatever you needed. So a big difference was in the preservation of food.
Mm. Okay. Chris, do you have another question?
Yeah, so I have one more question. Can you talk about a part of a book that was just wonderful to write and why? And then a part of the book that might have been challenging or difficult to write and why that would have been too?
Yeah, I think I'll use the same part, because the part of the book that was hard to write and also gave me new perspective on the woman I knew, my whole life, who raised me, was to imagine my grandmother on the eve of her wedding, which was also Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Um, to not just know that was a fact. I always knew their anniversary was Christmas Eve, but when you pair that she was 14, he had just turned 19. Um, she wanted to be a school teacher. Her parents said, no, you should stay home and get married. It's dangerous out there for Black school teachers. Um, Writing that gave me insight to my grandmother as a girl and as a woman. She was interviewed and one of the things that triggered it was that she was interviewed by a reporter once, and they asked her what was her her favorite, her most memorable Christmas. And I'd seen this clip, I knew about it when she got interviewed. I was part of the reason why she got interviewed because I was working at the paper at the time. And I just took her answers and thought, okay, well, that's great. Because she talked about her mother stacked her apple cake. And she talked about a memory of a doll that her grandmother made. Her mother made a corn husk doll for her, and made it in such an intricate way that she walked in and it was sitting on the couch, and how excited she was about it. And it took me all these years later until I was a grown woman that I said,
Good
she did
dog.
not talk about that she had just gotten married. She never
Yeah.
talked about that was the eve of her wedding, that
Mhm.
Christmas Eve was her anniversary. So that made me see my grandmother in a whole new lights, which was, it's interesting to think of our parents and our grandparents
Yeah.
as women and men, or as
Yeah.
girls and boys.
Yeah.
Um, so that was that moment of like really thinking about her as a 14-year-old who I believe loved my grandfather, but also had higher aspirations for herself outside of marriage and never was able to fulfill those.
Hmm.
Mm. Okay, I have one last question. How is it to run one big books and coffee shop with your husband?
Oh, it was wonderful. The problem that we loved it. And the problem was that we are both writers and we're both readers, and
Mm.
we love community. We love a community of words. Um, but it was not a nonprofit. It was supposed to it was supposed
Yeah,
to turn a
I
profit
know.
and be a business. And so
Yeah,
that was
the
the issue.
difficulty. Yeah.
Um and we live in a town where there are lots of bookstores,
Hmm.
Oh,
and lots of
yeah.
coffee houses. Um had we lived somewhere else, I think it would have been more lucrative because people were asking us to move to other towns because they wanted
Oh,
a bookstore and wanted a black bookstore in their town so bad. But we didn't do that. So it was a labor of love, and we loved
mm,
every minute of it.
okay.
I'm gonna try the coffee. I'm gonna try the latte.
Oh, it's so good. It's
Yeah,
so
I'm
good.
excited about it. I don't know. Is that
Okay,
time
so
for her to read?
yeah, a little bit of reading from Crystal.
Well, you talked about the bread, so I'll read just a little of that. It's the chapter called "What These Women Know About Bread." There is cornbread in my blood. I can make it in my sleep, but it's hard to give someone else instructions unless they are standing right beside me in the kitchen. Ron, my husband, called me recently while I was away for a writing conference and asked me for my cornbread recipe. I hesitated, got a little angry that someone who has actually cohabitated with me for almost 15 years wouldn't know how to make cornbread. But then I remembered he's from Louisville, a city boy. Didn't your mama make cornbread? I asked him. He named 2 box cornbread mixes that taste like cake, though I'm sure Miss
Ooh,
Helen made a fine skillet of cornbread in her day. She's in her 90s now and no longer cooks, but she is a country woman too, born and raised on the Tennessee border down in Franklin, Kentucky. And
I
I'll
like
stop
that
there. I
one.
know we're getting
Yeah.
close, but that's one of my favorite chapters because there's so much there's humor in it, and then I transition and go into to Aggie
I
making
love that.
cornbread.
That's my next. That and the King of Sugrum. Sugrum is my favorite. Like I
Yeah,
love that whole thing.
absolutely.
I was like, yep, here I am. I'm here for the fictionalized version of this.
Yeah.
Those are my favorite 2 chapters in the books.
Okay, well, I think this is going to bring us to the end of our discussion. Thanks so much, Crystal, for coming and speaking to us about your wonderful book, which I hope people will pick up immediately. Come on, people, don't play. Come and get this book because this would make a great gift as well, especially
This
for someone who wants.
also would be a really good. I'm always thinking about the craft and writers. For anybody, I feel like who, especially if you're a fiction writer and you're thinking about nonfiction or you're thinking about how to play with form in your fiction, I
Yeah,
think this is a very good book to pick up.
very good.
And it's also a very good book for those of you who may teach a hybrid class to
Yeah,
think about teaching as well.
absolutely.
I think there are so many parts of this in terms of the lyric essay and the braiding of like what is fictionalized historical narrative and something like the lyric essay that can be pulled out
Yeah,
of here to teach students.
Yeah, and one of my
definitely.
heart of hearts for the book was that it would go from the nightstand to the kitchen.
Yeah.
That it
My
would
husband
go.
is the cook in my family, and he's already identified like several things that he's gonna try.
He wants to make.
Yeah, we have like a stand where he's just like, just put it right here when you're done. Put it right
So
here.
wait,
So
if
it's gonna
if
be in
you
my
want to, if you would recommend a recipe, Christopher, which one would you recommend for someone who is not a great cook, but wants to make something from this book? Which one would you recommend?
The biscuits, of course. The biscuits or the cornbread. The bread, those two things would be good. Or the greens.
And which recipe do you think is the most difficult to make in here?
The jam cake.
Yeah.
Ah,
I would say that because I wouldn't mess with the fruitcake. I let my people do that.
I don't know. I might
Yeah.
try the cake because I'm a good baker. I can
Yeah,
bake.
it's good. I
I'm
mean,
a
it's not
yeah.
so difficult, but people find it daunting because of all the ingredients and mixing all
Ingredients
the
you have to
ingredients.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. It was a
Thank you all.
pleasure,
Thank you.
Thank you.
and we can't wait for your next book. I
I'm
love
gonna
It's
go
it.
back.
coming.
I'm gonna go back. I'm in my like you put me back in my story cycle era. Like I just read a book by a woman named Lucy Evans who talks about the story cycle and references a bunch of books. And I'm just like, I'm just gonna go back and read these two in tandem. I'm gonna read probably Bird of Opulence with that theoretical book and just get my life.
Oh,
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
yeah. All right. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody in the chat for coming. We really appreciate you. And like I said, go out and grab Crystal's book. You will not be disappointed. So I'll see
Yes.
you really soon with another interview with an author. And thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.